For me, entrepreneurship isn't what I do, it's who I am. I am an entrepreneur. It's what gives me energy. It's what I enjoy. It's what I do for recreation. So it's the duality of focusing on that, but then at the same time, as a person who enjoys connecting with people, being able to build quality relationships with people and build ecosystems where value is created and that you participate.
So thanks for coming on, Brad. We really appreciate it. Been great to get you all to know you over the last couple of months as we've started to work together a bit more. And I absolutely you'd be a good guest, and I agreed. So
It's very generous of it.
yeah, I know he's like that sometimes.
So, obviously we've talked to quite a few people around how they define well. How would you define well for yourself where you are at currently?
Yes, I think there are aspects of wealth. I think that you have financial wealth, and I think getting the definition of what we're talking about and wealth is really important. And I think the question you're asking is to the more holistic side. It's what is wealth, I think wealth is having the balance of life to be able to do what you want to do, what gives you energy, what's aligned with your values, as opposed to doing what you have to do because you don't have other options. And I think financial freedom is one of those things, along with health, well-being, human capital, etc. And it all adds to the wider picture of wealth.
Okay. And so what are you working on at the moment to build your well?
So I'm a very entrepreneurial person. I'm inherently driven to look for gaps and find ways of creating value. So I've got quite a few different ventures that I'm involved in, kind of across a range of sectors and industries, most of which are centered around private capital allocation. And I spend a lot of my time focusing on building up human capital as a core resource, because for me, entrepreneurship isn't what I do, it's who I am. I am an entrepreneur. It's what gives me energy. It's what I enjoy. It's what I do for recreation. So it's the duality of focusing on that, but then at the same time, as a person who enjoys connecting with people, being able to build quality relationships with people and build ecosystems where value is created and then you participate.
And the word entrepreneur for a lot of people for a long time was a bit kind of ugh, right? So how did you, from what you've just said, you are happy to take that title as your own, like you said, that's who you are. So was there ever a point in time where you kind of didn't want to own that and you've somehow moved forward to own it? Or it's something you embrace full and wholeheartedly when you first started out?
Yeah, labels are a funny thing. And there is certainly an ickiness with the term entrepreneurship or being an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's not, or at least I haven't come across a better term that defines, a person who inherently looks for gaps in market and crafts solutions. So, I suppose I take any label with a degree of reluctance, but eventually you have to embrace something. And so I suppose it's settle fine.
Okay. So we ask a lot of questions about what people are currently doing to build wealth and what they did when they first started. If you think about 10 years, what were you doing at that point to build wealth?
So I probably have to take a slightly bigger step back to give context on that. Okay. So my earliest memories were, I was always interested in money. I was always interested in trade. Some of my earliest memories were looking around the house as I must have been 3 or 4 years old for items that I deemed unnecessary and sort of selling them on the front gate to passers-by. Oh, good. And then growing up, always using spare time to create things, always inventing something or designing something or whatever. And so, if I accelerate through a little bit, I started my career in construction because I think, property development, building things is the ultimate form of creation. It's very tangible, which is always quite appealing. But then around GFC, obviously that took a bit of a sour turn. And I don't think it worked for others really up to that point, and sort of decided that it was time to sort of do some of my own things. And so that sort of escalated a journey that sort of went through seeding various ventures, some which succeeded, some which didn't, and ultimately led into a pathway of what you call management consulting or advisory to open up access to different markets, different ways of thinking, etc. But 10 years ago, I was in the midst of really got my teeth into probably one of my first significant businesses, which was a business that I bought out of liquidation, restructured and salvaged. So I was really head down, bum up, focusing on everything that's involved with a significant turnaround.
Yeah, so can you talk us through that a bit? We haven't actually talked to anybody who's bought a business out of liquidation before.
Yes, I mean, I don't come from wealth or means. I built financial wealth. I come from very significant, familial wealth and great relationships there. And I'd had aspects of entrepreneurship demonstrated to me. My dad was a farmer growing up, and farmers are inherently entrepreneurial by what they do. And a grandfather who indicated, who was always thinking of ways to generate extra income for his family. So I always had those little anchors that sort of led to that never really came from eager financial resources. Got married quite young, and obviously all of the challenges that come with that. Wife was a student. I was on quite a low income myself as a junior project manager at the time. And so when I made that transition from my career as a project manager and moved into the sort of more focused consultancy space, didn't really have any capital, but I had a very deep burning desire to get out there and get stuck in. And so knowing that I didn't really have the capital, that sort of gave me two options. One was found something and started, and a mate and I started doing that in the e-commerce space. But then I'm quite a generalist by nature, so I have a good proclivity to understand all facets of business and commerce, but I'm not an expert in any one thing. If anything, I've got a strength towards strategy and business development, etc. But so I knew I had a well-rounded skill set that was developing that I wanted to sort of test, and so I was really eyes on stalks looking for an opportunity that I could get into. And an opportunity came along with my father-in-law, who was working inside the business. That sort of got themselves into a bit of strife. They had taken on a project that was a little bit outside of their capability. And coming from a project background, I was able to have the skill sets to help with the bat on trap. By that stage of my career, I'd done quite a lot in construction. And we were in a bit of an interim phase with the e-com business where we were waiting for some software to be developed. And so I had a bit of time up my sleeve. And so I thought, well, I'll play them and I'll give these guys a hand. Gives me a bit of cash flow. Great. So I jumped into that, and sort of one thing led to another. That engagement extended. I realized that all wasn't well back at the rush with the business. Fortunately, got on quite well with the ND and said to him, listen, I've got the tie. If you want, I'm happy to roll up my sleeves and do a bit of analysis on this. So basically that led to a 2-3 month engagement where I got to understand the business really well, which also showed you that the business was really not well.
Yeah.
And so I started synthesizing a bit of an intervention plan for them. The business was quite small, turning over 2.5 million, breaking even to losing money. And so, I prepared a plan for them that could show them within 2.5 years to get to 10 million and 2 million bottom line. Presented that to them, and then that ND had a relapse. He was in remission for cancer. and he had a relapse, and I actually had to stick into that business as the pseudo GM just because there really wasn't anybody else. So I sort of juggled back with my own venture. And then about 6 months later, he passed away. And that business was sort of left in a very precarious position in terms of tied up working capital and, not very much an owner-founded business. And so when that owner passed away, it was left without anyone at the tiller. And his estate elected to put that company into liquidation. And obviously I had to develop that strategy for that business. And so I sort of thought, well, this is a bit of a waste. Went back to a couple of key staff, one of whom was my father-in-law who had left the business but was looked to rejoin, and the other was the accountant who I'd worked with to help do the analysis. And effectively said, so look, I think this business is salvageable. If you guys are up for it, I'm happy to step in and let's execute this plan. And at worst, we're going to save some jobs, staff, and get something back on its feet. At best, we'll create a good Bible business. And so that began that journey. I was at a point in my life where I was ready to win or die. Trying. And so we threw ourselves into that, restructured that business down to about 13 staff, and sort of reset at that base, and then used that to scale up. And so we took that business from that to about 230 staff, probably about 5 years, via a mix of organic growth and then at a point, some sort of small acquisitions. So that then provided the first significant business and asset that I could lever to develop a business. So that's how we sort of ended up in a turnaround.
Wow. So it's kind of almost try before you buy. So you knew what you would be getting yourself into before you.
Well, this was a bit of a no-brainer because I had taken the time and had the knowledge, because of my background in construction. I mean, it was a $2.5 million turnover business, but it had $1 million tied up in working capital, which, anyone who understands the finances of running small businesses is a very dire situation. But I'd worked out where all that money sat. I'd worked out against the contracts how to go and recover all of it. And so, a receiver or a liquidator is not going to do that. It's not worth their time. So, knowing that we had the strategy to execute, which the liquidation said, right, I'll do your deal. I will do all the recoveries for you, but I want a commission structure against it. And that allowed us to effectively fund the purchase of the assets and the initial working capital.
So how did that work? And who was the beneficiary from that on the other end of the liquidator? Was it the family? Yes.
No. So that's an important point because it was a key driver actually in my decisioning process. I wasn't overly pleased with the way the staff were treated in the liquidation process. The estate had resources, and the staff, many of whom had been in business for quite some time, had worked, and sacrificed and cut or pay, and had significant leave provisions, and the estate could have paid them out, and they chose to not. And so, I thought, well, if that's pretty much directly in contrast with my values. And so, the deal I did with the liquidator was very much in our favor, but it allowed me to craft a good outcome for those staff, which are who we retained in the business. And so our win was effectively the assets. So, the estate was going to be fine anyway. It was going to be predominantly the staff in that situation that lost out.
Right. And then so you guys were able to pick up the asset on pennies on the dollar, basically. And then
yeah, I mean, a lot of the assets were quite tired, but when you are willing to jump into a business and bootstrap it, you can do quite a lot with sweating assets to get them generating cash. And so I wouldn't quite say it was pennies on the dollar. We probably paid market value for those assets, but because of the funding structure with the liquidator, it was advantageous for us.
Right. Yeah, cool. That's interesting. So what were some of the challenges that you faced from going for like, 2.5 mil a year and then scaling it up to ending up with 250 staff? Like, I'm sure it wasn't all smooth sailing.
No, look, it was a great opportunity to cut my teeth. I think, firstly, coming into a situation like that, your stakeholder management skills are tested from the start, which is great. Constructing deals like that, because there's actually more complexity behind that deal with a liquidator, that I wouldn't worry getting into, but it tested my mettle and thinking in terms of what we could do and how to make that work. And then in order to build a company that fast, obviously culture is really key. And so, it was within an industry where the reason we were able to scale was because we were able to come into that market with a whole different mindset around value proposition, which would resonate with a whole different category of client, which would allow us to get superior margin and access to the type of customer that we wanted to. So we did a lot of work initially in understanding our value proposition, who our key target market was, so that whole business was well-oriented to scale after it. And then obviously, built the culture up around that. And part of that was changing the conversations within the business and really changing the mindset of the workers, and getting them to understand and start to believe in the shift that I was trying to initiate in the business. So obviously there's a lot of effort and energy in that. Managing working capital and scaling a business like that, especially a services business, which is, that business was reasonably heavy on assets and services. So, we were fortunate in the earlier days that the margins were quite strong because of our value prop. And so we were able to put a lot of cash back into the business, which scaled to growth. And we were able to keep sort of debt exposure quite modest, and only introduce or leverage as we needed to, in ways that were reasonably responsible. In that industry, and in a lot of industries where you're dealing with blue collar workers and on the rougher end of the scale, or the tougher end of the scale, you're always dealing with HR issues, everything from theft to stuff that get caught drink driving, or I've had to deal with assaults, all that sort of thing. So all of the HR stuff added a bit of complexity. But probably the biggest challenge was putting together the systems and the structure that a business needs like that to scale, and to scale in a risk mitigated way. And there are probably key touch points for that. One is there really at the time were no off-the-shelf tools in terms of software to put into the business to automate some of the process. And the tools that were available would only deal with certain aspects of the value in the supply chain. So we ended up having to hobble together, using various tools, a collective of applications which we used to sort of start to create visibility within the business. So, for example, we went from a 6-week lead time in understanding at month end what our cash flow and performance was looking like, down to about a day over about a 5-year period. And so the difference on that is, if we're thinking about the principle that 1 degree off over enough period of time to send you a long way, of course, I think this everyday iteration is absolutely critical for success. And so, the exposure to us as a small business of, very little personal balance sheet to support an error meant that we had to grasp and navigate that very carefully. And so, that exposure obviously went from a couple of million down to the corrective action take within a day, which is in the tens of thousands. So that was a key risk mitigation for us. And then the other part was that business in particular operated in quite a high compliance environment. So particularly around health and safety management systems, quality systems, and compliance reporting, both based on regulatory requirements, but also key stuff that supported value prop for client. And so working out how we implemented from a standing start the right type of systems to capture operational data out of the business so that we were meeting up compliance requirements, etc. That presented quite a challenge for us. And we dealt with that in various iterations to the point where, towards the latter end of the journey with that business, we had pretty well dialed in systems that gave us really good reporting via an automated dashboard that was visible across the entire business on how we were operating against, the criteria that set the business. So those are probably, the key things.
Okay.
In terms of challenges.
Yeah, good ones. So do you think like the experience that you gained there, and you've mentioned a few times now, values, your value of, I suppose, culture and people is really important to you. Is that kind of what you took with you when you started looking at co-founding blocks?
Yes, I mean, going through the journey, building a business, especially something like that, it is both a rewarding but also very selfish endeavor. Endeavor to sort of take yourself on. And, I'd spent a long time doing that and sacrificed a lot of time with young children and that. And I still got to a stage in 2018 where it was never really about money for me. It was about money because money is resource and that allows you to have options and to deliver on the other things in life. But it had become probably a little bit too much of a focus, or I felt it was absorbing too much of my time against how I would otherwise allocate it, or my energy. And I'd sort of been reflecting on, what I was going to do moving forward and what I sort of felt my personal mission was. And I have a real passion for conservation and for people. So, my personal value set speaks into what I do. So I'm very driven around people having agency, people having self-sovereignty, having a society where access is equitable, but meritocracy still plays out. And I feel like and felt like at the time that entrepreneurship is one of the most powerful tools we have to drive societal change, because if we can influence where a dollar, how a dollar is allocated, we can influence outcomes. So, everything from how a consumer spends to how institutional investors allocate capital will influence and incentivize the outcomes that we, the velocity of that capital or productivity, right? Yeah, both. And so, when I sort of been reflecting on that and so around 2018, I decided to make a bit of a change and start to introduce some different ways of thinking into our business and how I was going to use both capital allocation and the entrepreneur skill set to start to drive different ventures to drive outcomes that mattered to me. And when blocks came along, I really wasn't looking for another venture to get in behind. I'm already pretty well committed. But a couple of things resonated with me. One is from a social standpoint, we know how important housing is to society. Everything from uplifting people out of poverty to bringing stability to the family unit. If people are less concerned about having to move house next week because they've had the rental shifted on them for the third time in 3 months, they can focus more on their job. The kids are more likely to be, in a stable environment, getting better education. People are probably eating better, so their health and well-being is probably better, etc., etc. And so all of these positive externalities come from, having a solid base, basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs principle. And so, I saw what Blocks was doing as a way to address one of those foundational principles, which I strongly support. And then the second piece was having a look at where the team had got to that point. And so a lot of intentionality in focus, execution, how they were operating, where they wanted to go, which really appealed to me. I'm a big advocate for doing things with intentionality. And then the other thing was I saw what they had structured, and I saw that it could execute at scale. Because people tackling the housing crisis isn't new, but structures that can do it at scale are few and far between, and structures that are unapologetically commercial are few and far between. And that's another principle for me. You need to know whether you are philanthropic or whether you're commercial, because if you don't know which camp you're sitting in, your decisioning process is complicated or confused. If you're in the philanthropic camp, you are always relying on the goodwill or sentiment of others to either take the haircut to support you or whatever it might be. So that's inherently part of your destiny is out of your control. So for me, with that particular venture, the fact that it is a phenomenally commercially strong model is really good, because if we want to operate at scale, we have to be able to attract capital at scale. And by attracting capital at scale, and using, being relatively ruthless around being a capitalist model, we get to put on a lens of social capitalism, which says, well, now that we've got this capital, how do we deploy it? What can we do with it? And so, that allows us to start thinking about how we create even more access points for housing, etc. So, those are the things that attracted me to Blocks.
So what is Blocks doing today? What's its goal today?
Well, we have a very clear focus of getting 4,500 families into houses in the next 3 years. So we've really got a bit between the teeth to solve that. Obviously, that requires quite a significant capital stack. And part of what I put my hand up to do is to lead capital strategy and investor outreach, and looking at how we approach go-to-markets with this offering as we roll it out. Because that's your biggest problem to solve as Blocks. Capital?
Yeah. Because renters want it, right? Hardest bit's funding it, taking out the banks, right? That's always what's going to be really interesting to me with the project, is that your hardest bit is actually getting that capital, and then it's about execution. So it's that, and so you're taking, I know the structure that they've developed has taken some time, and it's had a lot of expertise, and it's some IP that now sits in the business, but the business is all about capital, because you're allocating capital to then enable renters to get in the ownership kind of regime.
Yeah, look, I think that's a fair point. I would take it one step further back. I actually don't think getting the capital is the hard bit, because, again, I joined that business. When I first got introduced to Chris and Blocks, I was a skeptic. I come from construction. I come from real estate. And I had significant questions over how the model could work, could generate the return that it does, and is sustainable. And through taking the time to learn it, I became converted. I think the challenge is actually one step further back. I think that the investor education piece is where the challenge sits, because we have to shift mindsets, because we're operating in a space where people have entrenched views and they think they know. And we take, for example, rent-to-buy models. They're not new. They've been tried in various different guises over the years. Community housing providers are not new. Coming in and saying, well, we're coming in with into that space with something that is same but different. Because effectively what we have is an iterated version of a rent-to-buy model that has found a couple of key things. Value to extract out of the supply chain. So, disintermediating supply chains, so removing unnecessary steps and getting customer closer to product carves up value. Being able to do that at scale, because it's a commercial model, is different. And then there are other challenges with typical rent-to-buy models that this team has solved. Engaging with the right investors, who in this instance to achieve that capital stack are typically going to be either significant private capital allocators or institutional investors, means dropping into a space and asking them to remove the assumptions of what they think they know, and allowing us the time to show them how this is different. Because if we do that, we're actually able to then show, well, we give you a superior return with better liquidity, better security, and we're getting you a social impact alongside it. So the return profile relative to the asset class is attractive. And obviously it's an increasing requirement or desire for capital allocators to be able to demonstrate ESG or social outcomes. And so we can achieve both of that if we can show them why what we're doing is credible and how it is able to do what it says on the box. So that's what I think the challenge really is. It's in that crafting those messages to be able to cut through the noise of entrenched views or expectations.
How do you go about that? Trying to change someone's mind if they don't know they need it changed can be incredibly challenging. Trying to get them to see the light, so to speak. How do you approach that?
Look, I think, there's I think part of that psychology, and part of it is persistence. It's interesting. I don't know if you guys have read, for example, Chris Voss's Net is Split the Difference.
No.
Fascinating book on negotiation. He's an ex-hostage negotiator with the FBI. And if we rethink some of human psychology and how we approach situations and how we frame them, we can actually, for example, disarm people's sense of wariness. We can promote curiosity, for example. So I think it comes down to messaging and knowing how to engage with whom, with what message, and then doing persistence in the market. Because, if you do what you say you'll do, and if what you do is significant enough incentive, then the word will spread, and you will start to get purchased in the market.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that you kind of got your fingers in a few pies. What other pies have you got cooking at the moment?
Yeah. I've got interest in industrial business, industrial services, industrial and commercial real estate, putting together a quite bespoke specialist Pietersen advisory business at the moment. Have a significant position and interest in a global media and entertainment company. Have interest in consumer products businesses, both which are pretty nascent. And what was it? Yeah, those are really key ones. And of course, always have an interest in different financial services, innovators, and innovative products.
It's a lot, right? So that kind of the financial side of, I suppose, you building your wealth. What are you doing in the other areas in your life to build your wealth?
So I've always had a very strong focus on personal development, both in terms of technical skill acquisition, seeking multiple points of view to inform my understanding of the world and of situations. I think we're in a world where the majority of people will do 20% of the work to form a very superficial view of situations. I think the significantly greater work to understand complex situations is quite worthwhile because you gain deeper insight. So everything from geopolitical situations, etc. And then obviously the likes of podcasts and just try to fill my time with productive stuff that will either challenge me or show me a contrasting view to something I already think. I've always tried to balance health, fitness, and I would be pretty honest in sort of saying that you sort of ebb and flow in managing the balance between your family and the stuff that you want to achieve there, your own health and well-being, and keeping yourself able to do what you do. I mean, I think her name's Caroline Williamson did an interesting research paper from Waikato University on things called rest, zest, my entrepreneurial best. It's a correlation between rest and recreation and entrepreneurial capability and quality of execution. And it shows a very, very strong correlation between the two. And typically I'll do my best thinking, for example, when I'm out running in the bush, or we live on a farm, so working, physically doing something on the farm. And that's a lot of the time how I process stuff. And of late, sort of really been putting a bit more work into seeing how I understand my vision for the world, or for myself, and my value set, and how that applies to the world, and how I want to approach, in the coming years, again, with intentionality. I've turned 40 this year. And so, I sort of really wanted to reflect on what I wanted to work on, what I wanted to achieve, and then where I wanted to go with that.
Okay. And so you mentioned that you got married fairly young. How have you brought your partner along on that kind of journey with you?
Yeah, she's a very patient person. It's not always a very easy person to live with. I I think one of the advantages, like, you sacrifice a lot when you do something like getting married that young. I married, the widow got married. She was in her third year of medical school. I was a doctor. And so, both because of her study commitments, and also, and again, I'm not a big fan of wasting time. So, I was working during the day. I was going to uni at night, 4 days a week. And, so because of the life we chose to live, we didn't get to travel much when we were young. We were pretty skint most of the time, etc. But the corollary of that is that you get to build a lot of life together. You get to shake out who you are, the dynamic of your relationship quite early on. And so you end up, if it goes well, you end up in a position of stability earlier on too. And so, we've been able to build a really good life together where, I think we understand how each other operate. She gets me, and my ADHD, entrepreneurial mentality. And she is patient when, as you do, you go through phases where all you do is work, or, you just don't have the mental or emotional availability. And so at times she's picked up a significant part of the mental load at home, the parenting load, and quite recently went through, COVID was pretty disastrous on one of our companies, driven that we were building more aggressively, and that we actually ended up in a very distressed position. And, it required, a very emotionally taxing and sort of challenging 12 months. And, to have her alongside me just as a support, resource was invaluable. So, you're always looking for ways to rub off the rough spots, and there's always room to improve. And, like anything, it's a journey, but it's been such a blessing to, we've actually been together since we were 17. So, to have that much relationship equity built is super really valuable.
Yeah. So what is some advice that you would give to someone who is looking at building their wealth based on all the various experience you've had?
There are many ways you can get to wealth. I think it's really important that people take the time to understand who they are. You need to know, it's that whole hedgehog principle. What am I good at? Where's the market opportunity? What gives me energy, etc. And then the important bit of that is, what gives me energy, and how can I give value out to the world better than anybody else? And then doubling down on that, because people get it wrong. Time is not your most inelastic or scarce resource. It's your energy. You can leverage time, and you can hire people, you can outsource, all sorts of things. But your energy is truly inelastic. And if you do things that give you energy, it's that sort of well used saying, you never work a day in your life. But the other part of that is not everything gives you energy all the time.
Yeah.
And you will hit hard things no matter what you do. And you have to build discipline and resilience and tenacity to get through those things. And so I think that more than anything, knowing where you want to go and building the sheer bloody mindedness and tenacity that will get you through those difficult times so you can come out the other side is really critical. Because I mean, the situation I went through only a couple of years ago, it was really, really challenging. I rose with a lot of capital doing that, huge sum of capital. But what I learned through that process, I wouldn't undo that for anything in the world. Yeah. So you've got to know that you're going to go through challenges, but the juice will be worth the squeeze on the other side if you can hold course.
Okay. Awesome. That's great advice. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you.